Okay, that's a lot. So I am the second of four. I have an older sister, a younger sister, and a younger brother. My sisters and I are actually pretty close in range. My younger brother is 9 years younger than me. My parents moved to the United States from Pakistan in 1987. Well, my mother moved in 1987. My dad moved here in 1982, I think. I studied, so I went to a state school in New York. They're called SUNYs. So I went to SUNY New Paltz. I got my bachelor's in history and international relations. Um, I did a study abroad in Belgium, and then I took a couple years off to work and figure out what I wanted to pursue. And then I went to University of Maryland for public policy, and I got my MPP with a focus in international security and development policy. And then from that time, I've been doing a variety of different kind of work that's been related to policy, but then also program evaluation and cost benefit analysis.
Mm-hmm.
And so so the next part of my career now, as I'm unemployed, I've been looking at more policy related jobs. Of course it did. It's something so entrenched with who you are and how you're perceived that there is no way that it can't have not have an impact. So it of course has an impact. I think my earliest memory, which I would say would show the differences in which the way that I was raised versus what you think of as standard American, which means white American, how they're raised, is that my earliest memories were not in English, but they were in a multitude of different languages, flipping back and forth. So I spoke Urdu with my parents, Punjabi with my grandmother, because she was very specific on us learning our mother tongue, and English with my cousins and with my friends who lived on our block. So on our Brooklyn City block, because we all played outside.
Okay.
So just the multitude of just slipping in and out of English and into Urdu and into Punjabi. And I think also like going to school and bringing lunches to school from home that were always a little different. So food that wasn't like Wonder Bread, PB&J, but more like, oh wow, that's a very pungent onion smell. So because I grew up in Brooklyn, my story is very different from the majority of other first generation kids, because I grew up in a very, very diverse neighborhood. I grew up going to a very diverse school. Spanish was spoken as frequently as English was. So all of my friends were a nice hodgepodge mix. So I had plenty of friends who had families still back in Mexico or in Puerto Rico or in the Dominican Republic. And then I also had friends whose parents were in China or from Albania. So it just like varied the entire span of the world, I'd say. And I have a very unique upbringing, and that because I lived in New York City and that's where I grew up, that was what my life was. Oh, very much so. And New Paltz is considered a diverse school in its own respect. So I think when I was there, it was around 15% minority students, which for me was like, I've been thrown into the whitest pool that I can imagine.
Exactly.
But for America overall, it's very diverse. But for me, it was just really different. I realized that like the majority of women that I lived with typically tended to be white women, and they came from backgrounds where everyone else from their communities either looked like them or was very much like them. And so it was a bit jarring that I was their only experience as something that wasn't white and Christian. It was a bit surreal in some ways. You could tell that you could kind of taste the subtle racism and the subtle xenophobia, even though they never meant it that way. But I could always just taste it there.
You get that feeling.
The lingering aftertaste.
Yeah.
Granted, we were kids, so like, and they'd never had experience with someone who wasn't, who wasn't white. They'd never had such extensive experience, as in like, oh yeah, they might have had some non-white people in their classes when they were in high school, but they never lived with someone who wasn't white. They didn't understand different cultural inflections. No.
No?
No. So
Okay,
I maybe
you
should
go,
have
sorry.
prefaced, I maybe should have sent you guys something I wrote.
Okay.
So in May of 2017, I think you might have heard that a Bowie State student was murdered on campus.
Mm-hmm.
That was a hate crime, but it wasn't necessarily treated like a hate crime in the beginning. I wrote an op-ed about it in the Washington Post.
Oh, interesting.
About where I called on President Lowe to take further action, and he as he didn't. So what it was an open letter to him,
Mm-hmm.
and I emailed him the letter a few days prior to actually publishing the letter in the Washington Post.
Mm-hmm.
And it was about how he has not addressed hate crimes on campus in any capacity whatsoever. How they were kind of brushed under the rug and they were not taken seriously at all. When I was at the University of Maryland, the School of Public Policy, I was the diversity representative for the school. So I worked with the dean of diversity, Dr. Harris.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, like taking the temperature of what the students feel like our diversity issue is within the School of Public Policy. So I held conversations and chats with students, asking them specific questions about themes of race relations, racism, subliminal racism, subconscious bias, the intersection of racism and sexism, and how the school should be better, how our school and the university as a whole should be doing better, and what are the steps that they can take. I did this from 2015 to 2016, and then from 2016 until 2017, I had noticed a resurgence of, maybe not a resurgence, I guess it was always there, but it was showing more post the Donald Trump election. A lot of the discrimination, the xenophobia, the hatred and the bias. So that had come to the forefront, it had bubbled up. And so there were lots of like horrible racist things happening on campus. The Nazi posters, for one, I actually walked by a few of them, I wrote them down, because...
Why would you, why would you post that?
Yeah, like, everyone's got the right to free speech, but you don't have the right to be stupid. And then there was the incident of the noose hanging in the fraternity house.
Oh, yes, I remember that.
And it was not a big deal. When it happened, people didn't take it seriously, but that's a death threat. That's a death threat. That is a lynching threat, not just a death threat. That's a hate crime. That goes back in this country hundreds of years. Like, it is a targeted symbol of hate, and nobody took it seriously. And then I think there was another incident too. And then I think when I first started my first semester, a frat boy got suspended for like one semester for saying horrible things about people, about women of different races, and about the kinds of things he wanted to do, non-consensual things he wanted to do with women. So he only got one year of suspension or one semester of suspension, I don't remember. There's just a lot of anger about it, so I try not to think about it. But yeah, so I'd been making note of this, I'd been talking to people about this, I'd been talking to the administration about this, and no one was taking us seriously. And so when that happened, when that Bowie State student was murdered, like, it was horrendous and horrific, but I'm not surprised that it happened because it was leading up to it. Also, I should preface that while in school and while I was working at the State Department, what my focus on was terrorism and extremism, so the path to radicalization. So I'd been studying how people, specifically for my international security classes, how young men and women become terrorists. So how a lot of Americans and Europeans why they were going off and joining ISIS, for example.
Right.
And so a lot of what culminated on the campus, like the radicalization of that white supremacist, is almost parallel to the radicalization of Muslims and why they want to join terrorist organizations. It's different in the sense that it's not necessarily international in the range, the way that Islamic extremism is considered international, but right now, white supremacy and Christian extremism has reached an international level. And people aren't necessarily capable of seeing that or understanding that. And because I've been studying it for so long, I was seeing it, but I was like, it's like crying wolf and no one wanting to listen. He did. He did. He did respond.
My face says a lot.
My face always says a lot.
Yeah.
President Lowe responded. President Lowe used some of the points that I laid out in recommendations from my original email in his recommendations, but they were words, they were not action. And his initiative, his diversity initiative, hasn't necessarily done very much. It has no teeth. It is not capable of doing anything, because the only way to handle these things is if it's a entire process. It's not just like, oh, now we have this committee, it's going to solve all our problems. No, you have to talk to all of your faculty, all of your staff. You have to be able to discern what things are, like, it kind of has to be a re-education process to be able to notice what is racist, what isn't racist, what is a threatening sign, what isn't a threatening sign. It's about delving into it in a much, much deeper way rather than trying to put a Band-Aid on a much larger societal problem. I was 17, so it was right before I started college, and people look at you differently and they treat you differently when you wear a headscarf. There are things that you're shut out of because you wear a headscarf. People aren't nice. People are a lot less nice to you. They're a lot more likely to be hostile. It is horrifying at the way that people can treat children, and especially children who are a minority, because I was a child when I wore it. My parents didn't want me to. My parents were like, don't do this. You're creating a hardship for yourself. My mother didn't even wear a headscarf at the time, but I was headstrong, and I was like, no, I want to do it. I'm going to do it. And my parents were like, okay, if that's what you want. Because if it were up to them, there's no way I would have worn it. But I wanted to. I was very forceful about it, and I did. And I think back on I had to always be twice as mature or 5 times as mature as my classmates and my peers, because I was a symbol or a representation of my religious faith. And that's a lot of responsibility, and that's a really big burden to place on a 14-year-old. So when I was 17, I was like, yeah, maybe let's not do this for a little while. And then a little while became a long while. I think I would say the most important thing is, regardless of societal pressure, regardless of how you are expected to be within the society as a whole, and also from your family, don't ever shy away from being yourself. Always be authentic, regardless of what the expectations are of what you need to be. Be authentically you. Don't shy away from your identity. It makes you a stronger and better person. And all the things that you will face, because you will face hardships and you will face injustice and you will face discrimination, it will make you a better and stronger person. It'll help you see things in a way that you couldn't have seen unless you had been in this position. And I think it's also important to remember that it should make you a more empathetic person. It should make you more understanding to the plights of others who are in this situation and also worse. Like the tenets of fasting during Ramadan, it's supposed to make you more humble and kind and generous. And it's supposed to solidify the Muslim spirit.